Hi, everybody. Welcome. I am Robin Schwartz, CAP's Program and Grant Director. Welcome to day 3 of the 2021 Spring Rights Literary Festival. Spring Rights is a program of the Community Arts Partnership of Tompkins County, also known as CAP. There's about, I think, 33 more Spring Rights events going through the 16th and also continuing through November with writing workshops. Please check them out at springrights.org. I know you've all been to the website because you had to register, but I will put the link in the schedule in the chat, just if you want to see what else is going on. So the link that you're on now is for the panel that's about to start, but also for a 7 o'clock reading by Jack Wang and Jira Asim, Ithaca College professors. Jack, tell me if I pronounced his name wrong. And they will do a reading at 7 or 7:10, or is it 7, called Boys in the Void. I want to thank our wonderful sponsors for the Spring Rights Literary Festival. It's Ithaca College, Wegmans, M&T Bank, CFCU Community Credit Union, the Odyssey Bookstore, and the Ithaca Marriott. We also receive support from New York State Council on the Arts, and Poets and Writers is helping us pay our participating artists. Although this event is free, we always ask for donations to our general fund. So if you feel moved to donate to our wonderful organization, we came up with a byline today: access to the arts. Community Arts Partnership provides access to the arts. I'm going to put a donate link in the chat as well. Throughout the event, the audience will stay on mute. If you have, I love it when people put comments in chat. Comments, questions, anything you want. I love to see activity in the chat. The bathrooms are down the hall and you can just leave whenever you want. Local celebrity Mickey Quinn, who is the most fashionable person that I know, is on the call tonight acting as my technician. Mickey is many things, including an event producer. She runs Trampoline, Ithaca's premier storytelling competition event. And Trampoline is hosting a special curated night of storytelling as part of Spring Rights on the 13th, just one of many programs. So let us start this event. I am going to turn the mic over to Kate Doyle.
Okay. Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Mickey, and thanks everybody at Spring Rights and Community Arts Partnership, and to all 4 of these wonderful writers for being here with us tonight. We're going to start off. We'll be talking about how a collection of stories or collection of essays takes shape. But I've asked all 4 of them to begin by reading briefly from their work. And I've asked them to do something a little unusual. They'll be reading 2 short passages from their collection. And I kept that kind of open-ended, but Leslie was asking this just before we started, but if any of you want to say anything about why you think of those 2 sections as in dialogue, you're welcome to do that. And so we'll start with that, and then we'll dive into our conversation. Gina Nutt will be reading first. Gina is the author of the essay collection Night Rooms from $2 Radio and the poetry collection Wilderness Champion from Goldwave Press. She earned her MFA from Syracuse University, and her writing has appeared in Cosmonauts Avenue, Joyland, Lit Hub, Ninth Letter, and other publications. And she'll be reading from Night Rooms. Take it away, Gina.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm going to be reading, as Kate mentioned, from my essay collection Night Rooms, which just dropped in March from $2 Radio. And the passages I've chosen to read are about 40 pages away from each other, 2 separate essays, and they're different meditations on the final girl in horror films, which, if you're unfamiliar, is the woman who lives to the end of a horror film, usually takes down the bad guy, fights the monster, and ultimately survives. So from an early essay in the collection. One assumption about a final girl being the person who lives to tell the story is that her survival is attached to telling. She is expected to say it, to tell again and again. She can't live without a saying so revealing. She is bare before the audience. The moment is bare. And then in a later essay, I write, sometimes the unseen is more terrifying than what's in view. Movie magic, special effects, absence of light, safety details is horror. Blankness is horror. what the imagination adds to the blank space, how it answers the open-ended questions. A final girl gets longer. She does not know how much. There could be a sequel or several plus spin-offs. She may be a cautionary tale or joke. She could be a legend, immortalized and called back time and again through reverent homage, parody, or reboot.
Thank you, Gina.
You're welcome.
And next, we'll be hearing from Emily Fridlund. Emily grew up in Minnesota, and she's the author of the story collection Catapult, which won the Mary McCarthy Prize. And her first novel, History of Wolves, was a finalist for the Man Booker Prize for Fiction and awarded the American Academy of Arts and Letters Sue Kaufman Prize for first fiction. She'll be reading from her story collection Catapult. Thanks, Emily.
Hi, thank you all for being here. It's such a pleasure to be on this panel. I'm going to read just the first paragraph from the first story in this collection. It's actually some of the oldest writing for me in the collection. And then I thought it would be interesting to read, paired with that, the end of a story about halfway through the collection, which represents some of the last writing I did in the collection. After I had sort of gathered all the stories together, I sort of wanted to rethink the ending of the story, and I changed it from what it had been originally. So this is Expecting, the first story, first paragraph. My wife could take your skin off with one glance. She was that excruciating. She could call you to her with one finger. She could do long division in her head. Another thing she could do really well was sob, and I envied her this, assuming it left nothing to eat at her inside. It is easy to be wrong about a person you are used to. The day she left, she gave me an American flag packed in a clear plastic bag she broke with her teeth. I said, "What, you're going to war?" And she said, "You always wanted something to hang from the porch." She could be sweet and scornful at the same time. So that's the first paragraph. And I was thinking a lot about that line, about halfway through that paragraph. It is easy to be wrong about a person you are used to. That ended up being an important idea in almost every one of these stories, which are mostly about parents' relationship to children, friends, lovers, spouses, family members, and how they get each other wrong. The story, the end of the story that I'm going to read is a story about three siblings. The oldest is Hannah, and then the middle is Lynn, and the youngest is Saul. And it's a story that kind of speaks to many years in their lives, from childhood until adulthood. But the last part of the story looks at them when they are at their mother's funeral as adults. And this moment is when Lynn, the middle sister, is talking about a dream of a library she had in their parents' old house. She used to dream that there was a library in the basement that their parents were keeping a secret from them, and she believes it's a dream. This is her talking. The library only had books with creamy leather covers, she said. There was a wingback chair in the corner with worn arms and a single brass lamp. And there were all these old portraits of people on the walls, total strangers, gilded frames, frowning faces. 3 whole walls were covered floor to ceiling with books. Their spines creaked when you opened them up, and the words were written in this tiny, elegant font, like every book was a Bible. But listen, if you pulled a book from any shelf, all the other books shifted to fill in the space it had left. There were never any gaps. My room was the conservatory. Hannah was sipping red wine from a glass. They were in the basement of their childhood church, sitting at a long folding table. It had been afternoon not long ago, but now it was night. All the coiffed cousins and hunched uncles had already left to scrape ice from their windshields and beat rush hour traffic. Lynn and Hannah and Saul were waiting for their father to finish signing papers in the church office. Your room? Lynn asked, confused. Her own wine glass was empty. You're talking about that game we used to play, right? When like we were all crammed together in the back seat, stuck in traffic, tearing into each other. I don't remember any game. You get one room to yourself, Mom would say, and no one can ever come inside. What room is it that you want? She did it to stop us from squabbling. I said conservatory because I liked that room in Clue. Mom said kitchen, of course, and Solly, you weren't born yet, were you? Hannah looked over at Saul, who was sitting blank-faced on a column of folding chairs he had just stacked. His beard was damp. His long white fingers were splayed out over his knees. Lynn shook her head. That's not... I was born, Saul said. Hannah was giggling, tipsy. Lynn always said, library, library, library. I was born, Saul said more loudly. It was a game? No, it was a dream, she thought. Lynn felt uneasy now and worried that Saul might be crying silently to himself and irritated with Hannah for getting drunk. Why couldn't they ever pat each other's hands or tell stupid jokes, offer some measure of consolation? It unsettled her that she couldn't call up a single image of them all sitting together in the back seat of some car, stuck in traffic. She tried, but couldn't remember her shoulders touching Hannah's and Saul's, couldn't remember the drumbeat bass from another car's radio, couldn't recall Saul's sticky little arm elbowing hers, or Hannah kicking her legs out across Lynn's lap. She couldn't remember it, and then, like waking from a dream itself, she did, of course she did. Their mother whipping around from the front seat, her face tired but trying as she suggested her game, and everyone groaning when their father said bed. Shelter, the game was called, their mother's game. Saul was born, Lynn whispered. I was, he said. She lurched across the table to touch his arm as he sobbed. He shirked away from her reaching hand. Even so, his bearded child's face was so hopeful and so stricken that it seemed possible to Lynn for a brief instant that no other reality had in fact ever fully existed for any of them. That there had only ever been that old car on the highway with all of them inside, each locked in their own chosen rooms. And she wondered in anguish and awe how many times she would have to forget, and remember this again. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I love hearing from both of you how the two sections of your collection speak to each other. It's so beautiful. Okay, next we'll hear from Leslie. Leslie Daniels' novel, Cleaning Nabokov's House, published in 5 languages, is under option for film. Her fiction and essays have appeared in Plowshares, the Missouri Review, Gulf Coast, and the Louisville Review, among others. And she teaches at the Community of Writers Conference in Squaw Valley. And Leslie's at work on an essay collection, which she'll be reading from tonight. Thanks, Leslie.
Thank you, Kate. That was wonderful to hear both of those readings. Thank you. I'm working on a nonfiction memoir in essays, I guess. So it's more in flux, as in I'm still moving pieces around a lot. And I'm going to read from the beginning. And then I'm also going to read a little chunk of a piece that I really want to include, but I don't know if I get to include it or not. So it's a stretch. The title is This Won't Bring Her Back. After my sister Valerie died, I only read books where people didn't die, refused to die, came back from the dead. I rejected the bereavement memoirs that found closure, where the narrator moves on in the end. I had no desire to get over the loss of my beloved sister, to integrate the fact of her leaving her life, my life, all of our lives. Though I sought to understand what I was going through, I couldn't. I suffered, dumb as a beast. About 2 years in, I recognized that one thing extreme grief does is to fragment and disorient you. You wander as if in a fresh bomb crater, looking for the pieces of your home that once stood there. When Valerie and I were in our tough 20s, we were seeing the same therapist, a man whose portrait now hangs in the therapy hall of quacks. He said one memorable thing. He said that my sister and I had the same unconscious. He also said this to me over and over again, sometimes with what sounded to me like deep admiration. You are a terrible bitch. I hope he actually thought so. It was not some quackish manipulation. So that's from the very opening, I think. And this is way deep in, and it's called Tiny Man Dream. And I'm only going to read a little chunk of it. My first thought on waking up was, thank goodness I'm not in therapy. Or maybe it was, too bad I'm not in therapy because there's no one to tell this dream to. It's not that I don't want insight, but a therapist would seize on a dream like this as if it was a ticket to the meaning party. The dream had a very small man dressed in a maroon button-down shirt and blue pants, worn leather belt, perhaps glasses, fair hair, professing his love for me. His clothing, as I think about it, doesn't signify anything strongly. Here's a man who is neat and who is not stylish. He had a nice enough body if you consider someone who is 8 inches tall to have a physique. He dressed the way a nice man dresses on a Saturday, not to impress, but for neatness. And should anything happen to these clothes while he was, say, cleaning, it wouldn't matter much, unless those were his best clothes, in which case he must have been somewhat poor, or at least clueless. You could buy those clothes at any Goodwill store in any county, any day of the year, if you wanted clothes that would not get you a table at a top restaurant, clothes that would not get you remembered anywhere. That maroon shirt and those blue pants, not navy, but a wronger blue, would do the trick. The hair too, fair but not ginger, neatly combed to the side in a style that worked in Kansas in the 50s and may still, was a kind of don't look at me, or at least don't let your eyes linger style. And yet he was boldly, madly in love with me. Not exactly madly, because someone of such careful appearance would not let himself go wild, but sincerely, deeply desirous of me. I listen to the tiny man's protestations of love and desire, and I feel that I am, in this dream anyway, worthy of love and desire. I consider his size. I consider fulfilling his desire. How would that go? I consider cramming him inside me. Could he even survive that? Feet first? What about the glasses? At this point, the therapist would have come to their conclusion, which would have missed the important aspect of how kind I am being in this dream, how considerate of the tiny man's welfare. Would he smother in my vagina? The therapist, who by now would have been listening to my crap for 6 months, would head down the path of, well, at least she's willing to fuck somebody. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, and thanks for sharing your work with us at this stage in the process. I'm excited that getting to hear it. Okay, and lastly, we'll hear from Jack Wang, and Jack is the author of We Two Alone, named one of Canada's best works of fiction in 2020 by CBC Books. And We Two Alone will be published here in the US by Harper Baya on June 1st. His work has been shortlisted for the Commonwealth Short Story Prize and longlisted for the Journey Prize. He teaches writing here at Ithaca College, and he'll be reading from his collection, I'll reiterate, in the event immediately following this one as well. So please stick around if you can. And Jack, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Kate. I want to thank Robin as well, and I'm delighted to be on this panel with so many friends. And thanks to all of you for being here. I'm going to read just 2 paragraphs, one from each of the last 2 stories in this collection. As Kate mentioned, We Two Alone is set to appear on June 1st. And The last story is actually a novella. So although these are the last two stories, these passages are separated by about 60 or 70 pages. So the first story I'm going to read from is called All Hallows. And all you really need to know is that it's about a washed up Chinese American hockey player. he strove to be professional. He supposed it all began with the move to Tallahassee in the ECHL, which meant riding the bus to towns like Jackson, Mississippi, and North Little Rock, Arkansas, places anathema to hockey. He had grown up dreaming of donning the noble shield of the Rangers and squaring off against the winged P of the Flyers, the spoked B of the Bruins. Instead, he wound up facing a cartoon nightmare of sea wolves, ice pilots, and lizard kings, even a team called the Growl, 3 R's. Then the topper, the Tiger Sharks, announced they were moving to Macon, Georgia, and becoming the Whoopee. The apocalypse was upon him. So he retired, or rather fizzled into anonymity, and it goes on from there. So that's one paragraph, and the next story is the title story, We Two Alone. And as I mentioned, it's a novella. And I'm going to be reading a paragraph in the middle or toward the end of a long scene, an argument between the couple, the main characters in the story, husband and wife, both of whom are actors. The husband is a Chinese American Shakespearean actor and is struggling in New York City to make it. And she wants them to quit. She wants them to give up acting and to leave the city. And by this point, they've had a long exchange. They carried on into the night without bothering to eat or even turn on the lights. The darkness is south. At one point, he stood by the window and looked out toward the double decks of the George Washington Bridge, where traffic appeared as 2 streams of light, one red, one white. When they had driven across the country, they had taken a northern route through Vegas, Denver, Chicago, and Cleveland, and reached the city at dawn. As soon as they were past all the nothing on the New Jersey Turnpike, he woke her up. Crossing the bridge, they hollered, slapping the dash, the ceiling. Fort Washington Park is green and untouched as the day it was made. That was 16 years ago. You couldn't grind away for that long without wondering if you'd wasted your life, staked it all on some folly of youth. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe it was time to call it, time to admit he was no one special, just some guy endowed with consciousness like billions and billions of others. But when he thought of joining the Red Stream out of the city, he just couldn't fathom it. Not after all this time, not when his day was still coming. So, this collection, which I can talk a little bit more about the organization of it in a bit, but it's about the Chinese diaspora over the period of nearly 100 years. And so these 2 passages, I select them because they're about failure. One character, of course, the failed hockey player, another, a struggling, failing actor. And of course, failure is the stuff of fiction, right? It's more interesting dramatically than success. But more to the point, I think I was trying to challenge the idea of the model minority, the idea that being Chinese American means necessarily you're successful, especially when these characters are trying quite consciously to defy what they feel is expected of them, one becoming an athlete, one becoming an artist. But the struggles they face in trying to achieve a different idea of themselves. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chuck. So wonderful. Just thanks again to all of you. It's so exciting to hear from your work and just a wonderful way to start it off. So thank you. If all of you want to unmute yourselves so we can, the 4 of you want to unmute yourselves so we can all talk. be great. If he's going to put us all on the screen together. Okay, so I wanted to first start by asking you all when you knew you were writing a collection, whether you started out to do that or whether you found that along the way, maybe you wrote a few pieces that you realized there's something in common. I'd love to kind of hear the origin story of how these books came to be. And anybody who wants to go first is welcome to.
I'll talk. I found myself writing about tools. I mean, I had written quite a bit of fiction, but also wrote from time to time about writing, both for my students or for some blog or something. And then when my sister died, I was thinking a lot about what being an artist means and how when you're an artist or a sculptor, you have tools. And when you're a writer, there's nothing in your hands. And I found myself writing, she was very skilled with tools. And I found myself writing about different tools, but sort of thinking about like domestic tools, like a blender and things like that, and having them be focal points for pieces that I was working on. And I didn't really see it as a motif for a while, but then I started thinking, well, these pieces are all linked in some way, although some way is really where I am now, of connecting things more tightly, and it's a bear.
And did you ever consider writing a longer form, something that looks more like a long form memoir, or was it clear to you that this was?
I think it will actually be a long form memoir, but I also deeply appreciate books that you're allowed to read 3 minutes of and then put down. And that kind of pith, like Beckett or, Sarah Ruhl's amazing book, 100 Essays I Didn't Have Time to Write, or just, they appeal to me. So I think that this will have threads, but it'll also have discrete parts that, yeah.
Does anybody else want to talk about how your collection came to be? And maybe I'll add to that. What did this form offer you that maybe writing a longer narrative, what did it give you that writing a novel or a long form memoir doesn't offer?
I'll speak, I guess. I love that idea, Leslie, that you're talking about being inspired by tools and thinking about what a writer might use or doesn't have, how it doesn't translate exactly. I did not start the pieces in this book thinking that they would necessarily go together. I was writing short stories and I was publishing them separately over a very long period. So these stories represent, moments at different points in my life. Excuse me, but I think one of the real pleasures of collecting them together is you start to see these patterns and these resonances across stories. So I didn't see tools, but I saw in these stories again and again, there's imagery around houses and building houses and houses coming down. And dreaming about houses, and sort of that domestic space was really important to me. And it's always fun to go back after you've written pieces without a clear sense for how they might be connected, and see your own preoccupations kind of constantly returning. And so those questions around building houses and escaping houses and getting out of houses, that story the very beginning of that story I read, we have the narrator's wife leaves, and there's a lot of thresholds in this book and a lot of doorways, and I think that's the pleasure of bringing them together ultimately in a collection, is just to see all these different threads that you might not have seen if you're just looking at one story.
Love that. Yeah, absolutely. Gina or Jack, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, sure. I'll hop in. I had a similar experience to Leslie in that I came to the first essay I wrote following death in my family. And I was just I felt I like your reading, Leslie, where you were writing about tools and thinking about how other art forms, they have these physical tools. I felt at that point like writing was very useless to me. That's the shape my grief took. And I think I really leaned into writing about death at a point. And it came to be that I felt like followed by death. And so I leaned into that and writing about a horror movie that had resonated for me in relationship to death and anxiety. And that took about a year to write. But as I wrote that first essay, I was, of course, working on other things, making other little scribblings. And when I went to send that essay out, I just wasn't ready to leave the premise. So I continued writing about other experiences in my life and weaving those with other horror films that resonated. And it grew from there. And at that point, I think I always thought of it, I was thinking of it then as a book, but it's strange. I wasn't necessarily like, oh, it's essays. I think in my mind, it was more like, oh, it's a bunch of prose poems stacked together and maybe it's a memoir, maybe they're essays. I'm really a hybridist at heart. So I move between, whatever. And I think too, it's fair to say that until it's done, you can call it whatever you want. And, someone else might have a very different feeling about that, right? From agents to editors, like when you get to that place, like, and of course, even after a book comes out, people might read it differently, which I think that's really cool, is the different ways that people come to your work and encounter it. I think that's fun.
I love that. So essays kind of as the term for it came to you later on in the process.
Yeah, I think I think it's good to like just lean into the work and see where it goes and what it wants to be, rather than imposing my expectations.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Sorry, I've been on mute because my younger daughter has some friends over. So I apologize if you hear some voices coming up from downstairs. When I started working on these stories, I put a novel in the proverbial drawer. So I just remember, on the one hand, the freedom of getting to invent something new after working on the same story for a long time, and but also just sort of being eager for a project that I could finish quickly and send out into the world, as opposed to something that takes years and maybe doesn't go where you hope it will go. So All Hallows was actually the first story I worked on, and it's really about this guy who's still in love with his ex-wife. And that's set in the early aughts. And then the next story I wrote happened to also be about hockey, but it's set in Vancouver in the 1920s. And it's about a boy who wants to play organized hockey, but he's ostracized because he's Chinese, and he decides to pretend to be a girl, to play in the girls' league. And when I first started writing these stories, I was just pursuing discrete interests. But I think after I wrote these two stories, I perhaps first got the glimmer of the idea that I could somehow write across a century and connect these two. And We Two Alone winds up taking place in 2015, so it is almost a century. And the third story I wrote was set in Vienna. It's about the Night of Broken Glass. And I think probably that was the point I started to see the possibilities for broader geographical range. So what wound up happening is over time, these stories started visiting more continents, filling in more decades in the century. And the interesting thing is that even after the collection sold, my Canadian editor asked me to add a story to the collection because between the story set in 1938 during the Night of Broken Glass and the next story, which I'm going to actually read from in the next session, which is set in England in the 80s, there was a big temporal gap. And my editor noticed and said, well, I'd like you, she gave me a charge, basically, write a story set in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. That was my charge. And she said, you can set it where you want. And I decided to set it in South Africa because I wanted to range even farther with the global Chinese diaspora. And so, in other words, I started with very discrete interests, but by the end, it was very, very deliberate, a very, very deliberate effort to complete the arc of the collection.
Fascinating. Yeah, Leslie, go ahead.
I think Jack brings up something very important, which is the perspective of readers. I mean, I treasure having a writing group because it's very often that they'll see the bigger picture, or they'll see things as in relationship to each other that we may see as entirely different kinds of investigations. And to see an arc of a collection, it's incredibly useful to have a good editor or great reading group.
Absolutely. That actually brings me to something else, which Jack alluded to earlier, about the order of a collection and how you find a shape for it. And I'd love to hear from all of you about that, because I think some of the sort of conventional rules that we think about how a book unfolds have a lot to do with plot, have a lot to do with plot momentum. And, could you talk about, with these discrete pieces, how you find the kind of momentum of the book, the way it unfolds, what that process was like?
I've heard that you put the best in the front and last, and then you just fill in the crap in the middle. But maybe somebody else wants to speak to this.
I had a wonderful teacher, Amy Bender, who essentially told me that I was really sweating the order of the collection for a while, and as I think it was so freeing for her to say. I was thinking about which stories to include, right, and which to leave out, and I didn't have a clear sense of the boundaries of the project, and she just said, use your best work and feature the best work, right? Put it at the beginning, and so and the end, right? So that was helpful, right? And then thinking within that structure, I am so drawn to the idea of rhythm and tempo, right? And kind of like listening to the end of a story and then the beginning of it, the next one. And sometimes, those pieces were so essential. I don't know if a reader actually will read, one story and then keep reading on to the next one. But for me, as a writer, that was really important to just kind of think in terms of where to speed up, where to slow down. It's a lot like, juggling a lot of variables at one time, because it's a little bit like math too, in the sense, to mix metaphors wildly, in the sense that I as a writer, didn't want two voices to be too similar right next to each other. So I wanted to spread those apart to make sure that the distinctions were clear. So if I had two first-person narrators that were men, I didn't want them to be right next to each other. If I had a story about a child, I didn't necessarily want to put it right next to the another story about a child. I wanted to spread things out. At the same time, I kind of wanted to bring to the surface some of the ideas that were important to me, and being trapped and seeking escape was important to me. And so the question became, do I nudge the stories in the direction ultimately of escape or getting out? Or do I nudge them towards, increased entrapment? And it felt like, wherever I ended up, whatever story I ended up on would make somewhat of a difference in what I wanted to ultimately say in the book. And so the last image for me is a kind of escape, even as it could, I think, ultimately be read as a return to the interior and the trapped space. But yeah, I think that the ultimate point being that I think there's a lot of different things to think about potentially once you have the first pieces in place, and just kind of listening for me was important to the rhythms of the stories next to each other.
I love that.
I think.
Oh yeah, sorry, Leslie.
No, I think so much of opening a book is about welcoming the reader in some way. And you're telling, particularly with a collection, you're obliged somewhat to tell them how to read it, if they're very disparate pieces. So my advice would be to put something very welcoming at the beginning. That's for all of you and you could also spread them out all over the floor and take a walk.
Totally. I absolutely recommend that.
Gina, I feel like I remember you talking in one of your other events about your approach to this with your fragmentary structure and kind of hanging things up on the wall. Maybe you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So when you mentioned spreading the stories out on the floor, so I'm very like physical about my order. I'm physical about my drafting. So my collection has a lot of fragments, not only of personal experiences, but also cultural ephemera, horror films, things like that. So at a point, I got colored index cards and cut them up and basically wrote out different threads and themes throughout the book. And I taped them up on my wall and started moving pieces around. And I was able to see not only the individual beats, but I was also able to see a larger arc for the collection. And so I was able to see, oh, there's a stretch of blue cards here. That's all movies. There should be more me. There should be more memories here. And so that became a way to not only see the arc, but also balance things out a little more. And in the end, I had it ended up being a very circular collection where the beginning and the end those essays do speak to each other. But I love that you can just move pieces around, and it's easier than like printing. When I print out all the essays, that's a bit more in-depth editing. But when I'm thinking of moving the pieces around on the wall, it's more themes and threads. So that was a really helpful approach for me.
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of analogs for a collection, and what Emily was talking about kind of makes me think of like an album. Like if you're putting together an album, you probably don't want to put like all of your ballads together and then all your up-tempo songs. You kind of want that artful variation. And so you're looking for the contrast in sort of tone or mood and that kind of movement. And what Leslie was talking about, that, the sort of the old adage about the strength of your pieces. I think of it as kind of like a mall. You got to have your anchor stores, and you have to get someone to walk through the mall from one strong story to of course, the reader might not know the anchor at the end, but that's the idea. I think that you're anchoring your collection with your strongest stories, beginning and end. I just want to say that there's so many principles that one could apply to the organization of a collection, and there's no one way to do it. As I already alluded to, my own particular collection is organized chronologically. I wasn't too sure if that was the best principle to follow, but in the end, it made the most sense to me because I really wanted the reader to feel like they were progressing through a continuum. In terms of the experience of being Chinese in the diaspora and moving from a time of overt racism and particular kinds of fears, just of safety, bodily harm, danger, to the last story, which is about an actor. It's about representation. It's a different. It's the racism is much more inferential. So I wanted the collection to create a kind of taxonomy, if you will, of that experience. At the same time, there's a line in Belsize Park, the story that's set in England in the 80s. The character thinks time is not a line or an arc, but a sign, a wave, forever vacillating. And so it's not like this unidirectional thing. People move back and forth along this continuum. And obviously with the rise of everything going on right now in the country in terms of AAPI hate, I'm back to bodily harm and worrying about that when I step out a door. So, the idea of creating this continuum, but understanding that it's always in flux and people are always moving back and forth along the continuum. I just want to say too, that if you're out there and you're thinking about it, there's just so many different degrees of consciousness about organization. You could be very, very mindful throughout the writing of how all these pieces fit together, or you could just work on all these discrete pieces that you just gather together at the end, and an editor is going to help you organize them. You may not even have thought about it until that stage when an editor helps you, as I've heard people say that their editors help them, put together the collection. So there's definitely no one way to do it. There are many principles and often multiple principles that are sort of overlaid on each other when you organize a collection.
So speaking of editors, I wanted to ask you all about your experiences with publishing these collections or pursuing publishing these collections, because I think, there's certainly this persistent idea out there that people don't want to read collections the way they want to read a novel or a memoir. And did you come up against that? And how did you keep the faith, I guess, about what you were working on? And maybe do you have thoughts about why this form persists, what it gives us that, in spite of this idea around them, people keep writing them. What does it offer the reader? What does it offer the writer?
I love stories. I think at heart, the story is, one of the most beautiful forms of fiction that's possible. And I wrote stories for a long time before I even tried to write a novel. I think that's true for a lot of young writers, potentially. I had been publishing the individual stories in small literary magazines, and I pulled them together, and I did find that it was harder to find representation for the collection. What ended up happening for me is I sent the collection to the person who would eventually become my agent, and her assistant said she loved it, and then my eventual agent said she very much valued what she saw, but to come back to her when I had a novel. And so I kind of held on to these stories, and I had no idea if I would ever have a novel, right? I mean, that I was still writing stories, and so so I continued to submit the collection, and moved on to contests. So while I was submitting the collection, I was writing a novel, and I finished my novel, and it sort of happened simultaneously. So that my agent accepted my novel and agreed to represent it at the same time that this collection was chosen as a contest winner for Saraband, which is a smaller press that publishes story collections and poetry collections, and maybe some nonfiction too. It's possible. I actually don't know about that, but not novels, right? And so the two books kind of came into the world at the same time through two different paths. One sort of the more traditional agent path, and then this one through the contest, sort of small independent press path. And I'm really protective of this book, and I feel really, really honored by just the hard work of the editors and the people at Saraband, and just the the joy that they took in making this book. But I will say it was a more complicated process, and the story collection did come into the world differently than the novel for all the reasons that you say, potentially.
Well, I just wanted to agree that I think stories are still a more difficult sell than the novel. And what I had was a collection and then the beginning of a novel. And I think in many ways the interest was in the novel, and the stories were just a way to get at the novel ultimately, unfortunately. There was a major publisher in Canada, where the editors liked my work, but then P&L, profit and loss, the money people, they said, no, we can't go with a relative unknown with a story collection. But I think if it had been the other way around, if the novel were finished, that might have been different. So I think that is the reality. It still remains the reality of the marketplace. If you want to go with a certain kind of publisher, there are many wonderful publishers who are not driven primarily by profit. But ultimately I was picked up by an independent, a large independent in Canada, and picked up by their short story imprint, dedicated to publishing short stories, and eventually picked up by a new imprint at HarperCollins called Harper Via, that actually is was primarily created to publish stories in translation, but their mission is to basically publish stories, global stories. So my collection just fit well into their mission because of its global scope. And they do publish authors in English as well, but sometimes it only takes one and you just have to find the right home.
I worked in publishing for a long time, and I could bore you all about what sells and what doesn't, but I want to say something that's profoundly true, which is that writers make it happen. So that I'm thinking about Carmen Maria Machado's collection, My Body and Other Parties, which is just, it's so outrageous. It's funny, it's experimental, it's daring, it has huge range, and it announces a voice. And I think it's been commercially as well as critically successful. And I think one of the things a collection allows writers to do is to really expand what they want to share. And that's kind of magnificent. And as a reader, I love that. I love knowing that I can page through something and have very different experiences. Whereas with a novel, there's that middle part where they have to make it all fucking work, and it can get really dreary, even in wonderful writers. So I think there's I haven't I mean, some parts of what I'm working on, some pieces have come out or are coming out in different places, but I haven't yet submitted this to my agent. So I'm in a place of like wanting to make it work. And unlike Jack's advice, which is an editor is going to fix it for you, I say no. I say you have to make it really, really visible before you show it to your agent. Just make it absolutely viable and visible as a book before it leaves your little house.
That was my experience, Leslie. I'm glad you said that, because that was my experience, was feeling like I needed to make the book as awesome as I could on my own, because I don't have an agent. And before I sent to the press, who ended up taking it, $2 Radio, and they're a small indie press based out of Columbus, Ohio. I had queried like just a few agents just to see it. I was just curious. A couple of writer friends had been like, just try it. And it was cool. Like I talked to some people, but ultimately like no one wanted it. And I was like, well, I'll try $2 Radio, because I'd followed them for so long and I loved the work they did. And I've been incredibly happy with them and working with my editors there very closely in editing. I've been really happy with the amount of transparency in terms of who they're sending it to, knowing, oh, this book is going to this review, I get to know all those things. And I have friends who've had books on large houses where they don't have that information. They don't know if it went to X, Y, or Z. And I'm not saying that's the case for all of them, but, I know what I know from my experience. And that's that I've had a lot of information that has at least given me some peace of mind as I've like weathered the publication and post-publication waters. Because it's nice to know. It's nice to know people care about your book and they're pushing it and they're trying to share it with people. And I've just been amazed that that it's mainly two people doing the work that, their entire marketing teams. And Emily, you mentioned Sarah Band. That's a fantastic press too. I have a friend with an essay collection coming out on Sarah Band next year. So yeah, that was cool to hear. That yours is out with them.
Yeah, they've been a pleasure to work with.
Yeah, I've heard good things. So I think a lot of it is about finding the best home for your work. And I think a lot of that comes from reading really widely, because there's no other way to figure out like, oh, should I send this book to this editor? I mean, and that's how, if you decide to go the agent route, that's usually how you decide, oh, I would send to, you know, I love this person's book, I should send to their agent. So I think reading is probably like just as, if not in some ways more important than the writing. I mean, you have to get the writing done, but it's also really important to like read widely and read stuff you don't like and decide why you don't like it. I love doing that because then you make up your mind about something. Yeah.
I just wanted to say really quickly that I agree with Leslie and Gina, actually. As a writer, I think you need to take the project as far as you can take it. And it's not usually the case that you can just sort of drop a pile of loose pages in front of an editor and ask them somehow to sort it out. That's not how it works necessarily. But at the same time, this is a great collection, How to Pronounce Knife by Subankan Tamavongsa. And, she talked to my class recently, and she talked about how there's 14 stories in this collection. That's a significant number. They're relatively short. And her editors, ultimately helped her settle on an order. So this is to say that, yes, you should definitely think about it and take it as far as you can go. But just like being asked to add a story to a collection or change the order, there are people who can fine tune things and help you as part of the process. As Leslie suggested earlier, too, a good editor will go a long way.
And just practically, I think it's really wonderful as a writer who's also working in the long form to have another form to go to and to be publishing along the way, and it's a way to kind of stay intellectually and creatively to feel kind of awake and alive when you're kind of banging your head against a really long project. And then when it came to actually submitting my long project to the person who would eventually become my agent, it was so helpful that she loved the stories first, right? I mean, that no doubt she gave the novel a more sympathetic read, right? So I think there's a lot of value just practically in writing stories, along with the fact that I just love them.
I think too, like, that things can, so if you're writing stories and toggling between long form and shorter form, when we toggle between different projects or different pieces of writing, I find that sometimes writing something else teaches me how to go back and write the other thing. Even if it's on a longer scale, I think it can be very helpful to say, oh, this is how I'm fixing this story. Okay, maybe I can carry that to this essay or this poem or a novel.
And when you're sick of something, it's so wonderful to have another project sitting over, in another window that you can open up. It's really helpful.
Oh, fascinating. It's so wonderful to hear about all your different routes to these books, and so much wisdom here. So thank you. We just have a couple minutes left, and so I just want to say that if anybody wants to drop a question in the chat before we wrap up,
we can actually go, if anyone has any questions, to 7:05. I left a lot of time between events, but we can. The other one starts at 7:10.
I have a question for Kate, which is, I happen to know you're working on a wonderful novel, and yet you came up with this idea for a panel, and I was wondering whether it had personal resonance for you.
Well, I wrote a short story collection first, and I had a similar experience, kind of, it sounds like, to what Jack experienced, where I queried with a story collection and I got an agent based on that. And we are, shouldering through the process of trying to find where that will land. But writing a novel was sort of pushed as, I knew I wanted to write a novel next, but only glimmers of what that would be. So I ended up writing a lot of novel in the past year and a half, as I've tried to figure out what will happen to these stories. So yeah.
I also queried my agent with stories, and she said, write me a novel. At that point, she had a baby. By the time I finished the novel, the baby was her assistant.
Funny.
Um, but I also feel like, I don't feel like with this collection that I'm at the point where I have I feel sort of like I'm answering a lot of questions about, is it the right order? Are they where they should be? Is it unfolding right? Where does it need more edit? So this is
I think the screwball thing, and this is not just true of nonfiction, but I think the order is kind of a portrait of yourself. And that's a horrible thing to say, but it's true. I mean, it really shows like a lot of who you are that you may not even want the world to know. So it's tricky to come up with the right order.
We actually have a question here in the chat about whether anyone wrote a novel first or a long form first and then moved on to shorter forms. Anybody?
The only thing I would say is that there were I said before that I was writing stories and then eventually wrote a novel, but I occasionally along the way I would think, okay, this could be a novel, and I'd hit a certain page number and it would just collapse back down,
What page number is that, though?
Right, it's like page 30 or 40,
Yeah.
right? You're like, this is really going to be a story. It just is. I wish it could be something longer, but it's going to be a story.
Can I just add that one of my stories, it's called The Nature of Things. It's actually excised material from a novel. It was backstory that was going nowhere in a novel. But I'd done a lot of research and I thought there were some interesting elements and I wanted to make use of them somehow. But I also wanted stuff to send out into the world, as Emily was alluding to. Sometimes you need little successes right in the midst of that long project. And so when I cut it, I thought, I want to make this into a story and send it out and see if I can make something happen.
I think that's so true, that to have just a little burst of, if you can publish a story somewhere in the middle of a longer, difficult process, it can buoy you up to continue on, I think, sure. Let's see. Does anybody else have any? Actually, could I ask you all, could you recommend what's like a collection that you think everyone here should read if we haven't yet?
I just read a short story collection that came out in February called Land of Big Numbers by Te-Ping Chen. And it's about contemporary China and also some recent Chinese immigrants to the US, primarily about contemporary China. And it just seems like a frontline report and a really terrific collection.
My internet says it's unstable. So if I disappear, I'm not being rude and leaving the party. I'm just gone.
Better your internet unstable than you being unstable.
Thank you.
Somebody
else want to recommend a book before
I was going to make another recommendation.
Yeah, please.
Things to Make and Break by Mei Lan Tan. So I know I was on the panel for an essay collection, but that's one of my favorite short story collections. Emily Books, which is now I think folded into Coffee House Press, put that one out. And it has surreal qualities to it. I always recommend pairing that with Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. So if you like Her Body and Other Parties, I think you would like Things to Make and Break. And yeah, I love short story collections.
I love Machado's work. I would absolutely recommend that as well. I recently, not maybe in the last couple years, really fell for Ted Chiang, who does a science fiction stuff that's really great, Exhalation. And I'm not a science fiction reader, generally speaking, but I love his work, really love it. So Exhalation, I'd recommend. And the story collection I always go back to is Joy Williams, Taking Care. Joy Williams in general, her stuff is so weird and wonderful and sharp and mean and beautiful. So I always go back to that stuff.
Kelly Link is amazing in that vein. Yeah. I want to see
the collection that you mentioned earlier, Leslie, the Sarah Roll collection, 100 essays I don't know how to write.
Yeah,
so
I love that little book. I wanted to mention one thing that somebody very, very smart, Michael Barakiva, said to me just the other day. he said, you know, the outlier in your collection is often what you need to look at, like the thing that feels like it doesn't fit. And I think that's kind of a useful thing in writing in general. It's like, what is this piece that isn't like all the other pieces?
Mm-hmm.
That's my last piece of.
Oh yeah, thank you all so much. I'm going to turn it back to Robin. It was so great to talk with all of you. And if anybody, stick around, Jack will be reading again in our next segment.
This was really fun. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everybody. I was just writing something about Zoom. I really think that panels in Zoom really lend themselves to a more casual, intimate conversation. Because in the old days, the panel was all sitting at a table facing out. They weren't looking at each other. And then like rows and rows of people staring at them didn't lend itself to that sort of intimacy that we get with Zoom. I like Zoom because before that, I would just run around like a crazy person to 40 events and I didn't even get to hear any of them. So I'm having a great time this year. Thank you everyone for coming. I actually put the Spring Right schedule link back in the chat, along with a link to the Community Arts Partnership if you want to learn about our other programs, and a link to a donate page in case you feel moved to donate to the Community Arts Partnership of Tompkins County.